They took my horse and left me here. The voice came across the creek at dusk, and what happened next would cost Mathis Reyes everything he'd built his grief around and give him back something he thought he'd lost for good. Her name was Sahdii. She was a Lipan Apache medicine woman, standing alone and cold on a muddy creek bank in the autumn of 1883, with nothing but the clothes on her back. The men who'd robbed her were still in the valley, and they would be back before the week was out. She had seen their faces. She just didn't know yet that they knew it. This is the San Simon Valley, Arizona territory, late October of 1883. A widower running cattle alone. A healer traveling to her people with medicines for the coming winter. And a gang of horse thieves who made the mistake of leaving a witness standing at the water. Stay with this one until the end. The ending earns it. And if stories like this find their way to you, hit subscribe and like the video so this channel keeps bringing them your way. Now, back to the creek. Mathis Reyes had been running cattle in the San Simon Valley for 11 years and running it alone for the last 2. His wife Anna had died of fever in the winter of 1881, and since then the ranch had gotten quieter in ways that a man cannot fix with work. Though Lord knows Mathis had tried. He rose before light every morning. He mended what needed mending and replaced what couldn't be mended. He cooked for himself and ate quickly, the way a man eats when there is no one to talk to across the table. When food is fuel and the meal itself is just a thing you move through to get to the next task. Arizona territory in the autumn of 1883 was a hard place to be lonely, because the land itself had that quality. Vast silences and dry wash, and a sky that went on past the point of comfort, past the point of beauty, into something that pressed down on a solitary man from sunrise to dark. He was 34 that October. Young enough to understand he had decades of this kind of silence ahead of him if nothing changed. Old enough to have mostly stopped believing it would. He checked the lower fence line most evenings before dark, the way he had done for years, walking, copper, his sorrel gelding, patient and sensible, and so long familiar with this particular route that he navigated it more from habit than guidance. Along the bank of the San Simon, where it ran slow this time of year, a ribbon of water between cut banks, the cottonwoods going gold on either side. The light was going fast that October evening. The sun was already behind the Dos Cabezas Mountains to the west, and the sky was turning that deep bruised purple that comes in the last minutes before dark settles in. Mathis was turning over a gap he'd found in the north fence that morning, trying to work out whether it needed a full post replacement or whether a wire splice would hold the winter through, when Copper's ears went suddenly sharp. The gelding stopped without being cued. Mathis held the reins loose and let him stand. A horse that has spent years on open range reads the country better than most men, and Copper had earned his trust on this point many times over. Then the voice came from across the water. It was low and steady, with something underneath it that was not quite fear, but had the shape of a person who was decided to be afraid of nothing more that evening. "Someone is there. I can see you." Mathis kept his hands open and walked Copper forward a few careful steps, enough to see across the narrow channel. She was standing on the far bank, half in the shadow of a large cottonwood, and she was not what he'd expected, though he hadn't expected anything in particular. An Apache woman, young, early 20s at the most, with her hair loose and dark around her shoulders and her arms crossed over herself in the posture of a person who has been cold for some time and has accepted that fact. Her feet were bare on the mud. She wore a light summer robe of undyed buckskin, entirely inadequate for the temperature that was dropping around them even as he looked at her. There was nothing else, no horse, no saddlebags, no blanket roll, just the woman and the cold water between them and the night coming down. Mathis took the hold of it in about 3 seconds and pulled his canvas coat off without stopping to think about it. "I'm going to throw this across. Step back a little or you'll go in the water getting it." She didn't step back. She was watching him the way you watch something you haven't decided about yet, your whole body prepared to move in any direction. But she caught the coat when it landed and turned her back to put it on, which was the most trust she was prepared to offer a stranger at that particular moment, and he understood it and didn't push further. "My name is Mathis Reyes. I run the spread on the other side of that ridge. There's a crossing downstream about 200 yards. I know where the crossing is." He waited. She looked at him a moment longer, that careful, unreadable measuring. Then she walked downstream without another word, and Mathis rode copper along his bank to meet her at the crossing. Her name was Sahdii. She offered that much during the walk back to the ranch, in the same tone she might use to provide a practical coordinate, not an invitation, just the minimum courtesy she'd grant a man who'd given her his coat in the dark. She was Lipan Apache, a medicine woman, traveling east to reach a band camp 2 days' ride out. She had been carrying willow bark tincture, osha root, dried yarrow, and prickly pur poultice, medicines her people would need heading into winter, packed in a leather medicine bundle on her paint horse with a wool blanket and a week's worth of dried food. The Quillen gang had taken all of it at that creek crossing 2 hours before Mathis found her. 4 men. Hard, practiced, moving with the efficiency of people who have done this kind of thing before and found it profitable. They'd hit 3 small ranches in the San Simon Valley over the past month, always taking horses and tack and whatever cash they could find, always moving on before the law organized. They hadn't planned on encountering Sahdii at that particular crossing, but she was there, and her paint horse was good solid stock, and her medicine bundle was real leather that looked valuable from the outside, and her winter robe was substantially heavier than the summer one she'd been wearing beneath it. So they took everything and told her to walk. She did not beg them. She did not cry. She stood at the water's edge and watched them ride off with everything she'd spent 2 weeks preparing. And then she turned and began thinking clearly about what came next. What came next was Mathis Reyes and a canvas coat. The ranch house was small but solid, adobe brick and local timber, the kind of construction Mathis's father had put up in no hurry. Thinking about permanence. Main room with a fireplace, a kitchen corner, 2 small bedrooms off the back, furniture spare and functional. Anna had kept a few things on the walls, a small cross, a length of yellow ribbon from her mother, tied in a careful bow near the window where the morning light caught it. Mathis had left them where they were. Taking them down felt like admitting something about finality that he hadn't been ready to admit. He lit the fireplace and put water on for coffee and stayed out of Sahdii's way while she thawed. She sat close to the fire with his coat still around her, watching the room with the particular attention of someone new to a space who was still determining its geometry, the exits, the layout, the character of the man who lived in it. Mathis set a coffee cup beside her without making anything of it and went to see what he could put together for food. He fried venison with onion and set out cornbread that was 2 days old but still good. She ate steadily, not fast, the controlled discipline of someone who has known real hunger and learned not to eat like a starving person, even when they are starving, because the control is its own kind of dignity. After a while she looked up from the fire. "You don't ask questions. Figured you'd say what you wanted when you were ready to say it. Most men start talking and don't stop." He poured himself another cup of coffee. "Most men are nervous. Talking covers it." She looked at him directly for the first time since she'd gotten warm, and whatever she found in his face, she seemed to be working something out about it. "You are not nervous." "I'm a little nervous." He set the cup down. Just quiet about it. That almost made her smile. He could see it considering on her face before she let it pass. In the hour that followed, in fragments and with long pauses between, she described what had happened at the crossing. She described 4 men and the one the others deferred to, 40, maybe older, with a scar that ran from the corner of his left eye to the line of his jaw, and a calm manner that was more frightening than the noise the others made. She described the horse he rode, a heavy blue roan with a cropped left ear, and the style of the saddle, and the general direction they'd taken when they rode off. Mathis listened to all of it without interrupting. "There's a Quillen family out of Tombstone. 2 brothers, older one is named Hector. There were warrants on him 2 years back, then he went north. I hadn't heard he was back in the territory. A silence settled over the table. Then, carefully, they will come back. For me. Why you specifically? The man with the scar was looking at me while the others worked. She turned the tin cup in her hands, not looking at him. He was looking the way a man looks when he is deciding something. I could describe him to a marshal's deputy in enough detail to matter. He knows this. He was making a calculation while I watched. Mathis set his cup down. What she was saying had a hard arithmetic to it. A gang working a stretch of valley didn't leave a clear witness standing when they were planning to stay in the area. It was a liability they would want to resolve. You can stay. She looked at him steadily. Until we figure out how to get you east safe. Or until we can get word to the marshal's office in Tombstone. He spread his hands on the table. That's all I'm saying. You don't owe me anything. I'm not asking for anything. The spare room has clean bedding. She held that measuring look on him for a long moment, the look, he would come to understand, of a woman who had been reading men her whole life and had gotten very good at it. One night, he agreed. It became a week before either of them mentioned it again. The second morning, he came around from behind the barn and found her at the well with a full bucket in each hand, and the porch already swept clean. He started to tell her she didn't need to do that, and she gave him a look that stopped the words before they formed. I do not want to owe you. He nodded once. They understood each other on that point and moved on. He was checking Copper's near foreleg that afternoon. The gelding had been favoring it slightly for 2 days. When Sahdii came around the corner of the barn without invitation and crouched beside him, she ran her hands up the leg slowly, feeling for heat, pressing at different points with a focused attention that Copper, who usually had firm opinions about strangers near his feet, accepted without protest. Then she went to the small bundle she had carried under her robe, the only thing the Quillens hadn't taken because they hadn't seen it under the winter robe they'd pulled away, and unfolded it carefully. The bundle held what remained of her medicines after the robbery, a clay pot with a sealed lid, some dried leaves wrapped in paper, a bone all for lancing. She named each remaining thing and what it was for: dried willow bark for inflammation, yarrow for wounds, osha root for lung sickness, a compressed prickly pure cake that made a drawing poultice for burns and deep bruises. Brew the willow bark in water and let the horse drink it, and keep Copper off hard rock terrain for a few days. The inflammation was in the knee joint. She laid it out with the flat precision of someone explaining the function of a tool, not performing expertise, just stating what was true. Didn't know Apache healers worked on livestock. A body is a body. She resealed the bundle with the same careful attention she'd used opening it. The principles don't change because the patient has 4 legs instead of 2. He watched how she handled the medicines, deliberate, unhurried, aware that carelessness had cost her things she couldn't afford to lose twice. It was the economy of someone who had learned that replacement was not always possible. He had a shoulder that had been giving him trouble for 3 years. He didn't know why he mentioned it right then. He wasn't a man who talked about physical discomfort. There had been no one to tell about it, and complaining in a vacuum had always seemed pointless. But it came out somewhere in the middle of watching her, and once it was out, he didn't try to take it back. "Show me where," she said simply. He put his hand on the spot, right shoulder, deep in the joint, the kind of ache that flared in cold weather and made him careful about reaching for things above his head. She pressed along the shoulder in 3 precise points in sequence, then asked him to raise his arm as high as it would go. He got it to about shoulder height before it locked. This was broken. Thrown from a horse 8 years back. Thought it set right. It healed wrong. The joint sits crooked. She felt along the line of the shoulder blade. I cannot correct what is already set. But the tightness here. She found the exact point, and he made an involuntary sound. This I can work on. over several days. I'm not an invalid." She straightened up and looked at him with an expression that was thoroughly unconcerned about his pride. "I didn't say you were. Come inside in an hour. I'll heat water." She worked on his shoulder that evening by the fireplace for about 40 minutes, using heat and slow pressure and controlled stretching that hurt in a steady building way, and then, unpredictably, began to ease. Her hands were strong and precise. She worked without speaking, which suited Mathis fine. When she was done, he could raise his arm 2 inches higher than before. "You'll need this every other day for a while, if you want it to keep improving." He looked at her. One night became 1 week. She moved the pot of warm water off the fire. "I know that. I'm not complaining, neither am I." She set the pot on its hook. "Your valley is interesting. The ridge to the north. There is a seep up there. Alkali, by the smell from the trail. Does it run year-round?" Mathis frowned. "The North Pasture Seep? Runs all year? Why? Men camping in this country in autumn want water that won't freeze early. Alkali Seeps stay warm well into winter." She looked at him steadily. "If the Quillen gang is still working this valley, they will water there. I would bet on it." He thought about that for a long time after she went to bed. The days found their own rhythm in ways that surprised him by how natural they felt. Sahdii was up before him most mornings, which caught him off guard given that he'd been rising at first light for so many years that it had become purely involuntary. But she moved through the pre-dawn darkness with the ease of someone for whom night held no particular threat. She was simply up first. The fire stoked, the coffee on, and she'd be outside in the gray early light, standing still with her face turned east, watching the first color come into the sky. He never asked about that. Some things belong to a person in a private way that doesn't need explaining. She learned the layout of his land with a quickness that felt almost like memory, as if her mind was built for terrain the way his was built for cattle numbers. By the third day, she could water the horses and check their feet without asking where anything was kept. On the third morning, he came in from the far pasture and found her crouched by the root of the big cottonwood at the yard's edge, examining something in the soil. She had a small branch in her hand, and she held it up when he came over, a spray of narrow leaves, dusty green even in late October. "Yerba de la Negrita," she said, holding the branch out to him. "Good for inflammation." It grew along fence lines in this part of Arizona, but most people walked past it without knowing what it was. She went on to name 3 other plants she'd noticed on her morning walk around the perimeter, where they grew, what they treated, how you prepared them. She had the habit of a teacher, laying information out in a clean line without expecting him to already know it. He listened. Then he gave something back, showed her how he read the cattle for sickness, before symptoms showed, watching the way an animal held its head, the small delays in movement that meant a joint was swelling inside. The medicine of cattle, learned from his father and from years of watching. She took that in with the same focused attention she'd given the plant. They were trading knowledge, each one finding the other's fluency interesting rather than foreign, and neither of them named it for what it was. By the 5th day, she had reorganized the tool shed in a way that made considerably more sense than the arrangement he'd been living with, and he noticed and said nothing because she was simply right. She found a crack in the east wall adobe that he'd been meaning to patch for 2 seasons, and mixed mud and straw and packed it herself, working with a methodical patience that found the task itself satisfying in some fundamental way. In the evenings they talked by the fire, or sat in a silence that stopped feeling like emptiness. She had a low, direct way of speaking that said what it meant and left room for what the other person was going to say, and he found that after enough days of it, he'd stopped filling his half of the space with noise just to fill it. She described the band she was traveling to. 40 people or so, a tight community that moved seasonally through country they had worked for generations. She talked about them the way you talk about family, specific, complicated, with names and histories and accumulated small griefs that were just part of the texture of things. Her uncle, who was stubborn about the old ways in ways that were sometimes wisdom and sometimes just the stubbornness of a man who had lived long enough to be attached to his own certainties. A cousin who could find water in country that looked completely bone-dry. The elder woman who had taught Sahdii her medicine knowledge and who was slowing down now, part of why Sahdii had made this particular trip alone. The elder not being able to manage the distance anymore. She talked about her people with a grief threaded through it that she didn't name. She didn't need to. Mathis knew what it sounded like when someone spoke of community in the past tense, from across a distance that had no clean name, because of things that had been taken and couldn't be returned. He knew enough about what the army had done in this territory to understand the shape of what she wasn't saying. He brought up Anna that evening, unprompted. He hadn't talked about Anna to anyone except the priest in Benson on the anniversary of her death, and that had been a formal kind of speaking, more like filing a report than grieving. But sitting across the fire from Sahdii with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, things came out of him that he hadn't spoken aloud before. Anna had been from a cattle family in Sonora, the second of 6 daughters. She'd come north with her father when Mathis's father was expanding the herd and needed hands he could trust with breeding records. Mathis had met her over a corral fence when he was 23 and she was 20, and from that first hour of talking he had understood that she was sharper than him and funnier than him, and that this particular gap between them would probably not close over time. It hadn't. She'd been good with books and numbers, good at reading cattle temperament before the cattle themselves knew they were going to be trouble. She'd kept a kitchen garden with a fond, exasperated attention, talking about it like a minor child who grew things without asking permission. The garden had gone to weeds in the 2 years since she died. He hadn't been able to pull it or plant it. It just sat there under the kitchen window doing what untended land does, and he walked past it every day without looking directly at it. One evening, the 6th day, Sahdii looked up from the fire. Her eyes had found the yellow ribbon near the window. He didn't answer right away. The ribbon was Anna's mother's, a length of trade cloth Anna had kept her whole life, first tied in her hair as a girl and later just hung where the light found it. He'd left it there because it was the kind of thing Anna would have wanted to stay exactly where it was. He gave Sahdii that much. Not all of it. Just enough. Sahdii had turned back to the fire, was quiet for a while. Then, without particular ceremony, she was careful with things. You can see it in how she hung it. The knot faces the light on purpose. He looked at the ribbon. He'd never noticed that. He didn't know what to say, so he didn't say anything, and that was fine. Sahdii listened without filling the pauses. One question only: what had Anna grown? Herbs mostly. Some for cooking, some medicinal. Apazote, yerba santa, a couple of others I didn't know the names of. Sahdii turned to look at the dark rectangle of the kitchen window. They may still be there. Herbs come back from the root. He hadn't thought of that. The next morning she went out to the kitchen garden before breakfast. He watched through the window as she crouched over the overgrown beds and began pulling away the dead matter carefully, sorting what she pulled. He brought her coffee and she pointed out 3 plants that had come back from the root: yarrow, something he didn't recognize, and the epazote, identifiable even in its weedy autumn state to someone who knew what she was looking for. He stood there looking at them for a moment, and something moved in his chest that wasn't quite grief, or wasn't only grief. Something adjacent to it that was warmer. Sahdii didn't look up from the bed. Your wife knew her plants. She did. Good soil here. If you clear it properly and protect it through winter, it will come back strong in spring. He set down his coffee and started clearing the far corner of the bed while she worked the near one. They worked the garden in silence for an hour, side by side, and it was the most content he had felt in 2 years, a fact he registered with some surprise and did not examine too closely. On the evening of the 7th day, the Quillen gang arrived. He'd come in from the last check on the horses and found Sahdii standing absolutely still near the front window, looking through the gap in the shutters with a stillness that was different from her ordinary stillness. She held up one hand when he pushed through the door, He stopped and went quiet without thinking about it. He came to stand beside her and looked where she was looking. The yard was dark, the last of the sunset gone for an hour. But something at the tree line was wrong, a shape that wasn't a tree, catching the thin moonlight for a second, and then not. 3, maybe 4. Her voice was barely above a breath. Coming in from the north trail, I saw them 30 minutes ago. He looked at her. I was counting and marking their positions. Waking you before I knew what we had would have been less useful. They are splitting. 2 to the front. At least 1 working toward the back. He got the rifle from above the door and checked it. Then he got the revolver from the drawer, gripped it, and held it out to her. She looked at it for a moment, then took it with the matter-of-factness of a person accepting a tool. My uncle taught me when I was 15. A healer who cannot defend herself is a burden to her people, his exact words. He almost smiled despite everything. He moved the lamp to the far side of the room and then extinguished it, dropping them into fire-cold darkness. Better for eyes that were already adjusted, he moved to the corner where the shadow was deepest and crouched there facing the door. Sahdii went to the window without being told. She positioned herself below the shutter line and was still. They waited. The first sound from outside was deliberate, a boot heel on the porch step, not bothering with quiet anymore. Then Hector Quillen's voice came through the door, flat and reasonable in the way of a man who considers himself the most practical person in any situation he enters. He wanted to talk. He had nothing against Mathis personally. This was just about the woman. She had information she shouldn't have, and he wanted to discuss it with her privately. No need for anyone to get hurt over a misunderstanding. Across the dark room, Sahdii's face was composed. She tilted her head slightly. She'd heard something at the window side. He understood and moved. He went fast and low to the left, sweeping the lamp off the table as he went so it wouldn't give away his position, and the window shutter came in hard a second later. A man was halfway through it, blinking in the dark, and Mathis had him by the collar before his eyes adjusted and pulled him the rest of the way through, face down onto the floor. The man hit the boards hard and yelled. Quillen started shouting from outside. Mathis put his knee between the man's shoulders and called out clearly, "I've got one of yours, Quillen. Talk to me about what this discussion is going to look like." A silence outside that had a calculating quality. Then, "Take him. Call it even." "We'll go." "No." He looked at Sahdii. She had moved while he was at the floor. She was in the back corner now, very low, attention fixed on the back door. He understood they hadn't all come from the front. The back door moved on its hinges. Just to test pressure, a man feeling whether the latch would hold. Sahdii waited. The door came open fast and the man behind it was already moving inward, and Sahdii was there. She didn't fire. She put her shoulder down and drove into him with all her weight, using his own momentum to steer, and they went sideways hard into the kitchen table together. The revolver pressed under his chin stopped everything very completely. The room was entirely still. Outside, Quillen had gone quiet with the particular quiet of a man who is doing arithmetic about his options. Mathis had 2 of the gang's men on the floor of his house. The leader was still outside, and the leader was the problem. He looked across the dark room at Sahdii, and she tilted her head toward the open back door, toward the north, toward the ridge, toward the Alkali Seep. He thought of what she'd said. 6 days ago, at the end of an ordinary evening, Alkali Seep stay warm into winter. Men camping in this valley in autumn will water there. If the Quillens are still working this stretch, they'll be at the Seep. She'd said it with the flat certainty of an observation she'd already verified, and she'd said it 6 days ago. And the marshal's office was a half-day ride east, and there was a well-traveled road in that direction. And Sahdii had been watching and calculating from the moment she arrived at his ranch. "You sent word." He kept his voice very quiet. 2 days ago, the revolver didn't move. When you rode south to check the far pasture, I went to the Benson Road and waited for a rider heading east. I had the letter ready. I left it with a man named Calhoun. He knew the deputy marshal. He stared at her across the dark room. "You didn't ask." So I did it. He turned back to the front of the house. Quillen. He pitched his voice clearly through the shut door. I know where your camp is. The Alkali Seep on the north face of the Dos Cabezas Ridge. The marshal's office in Tombstone knows it too, from a report filed 2 days ago with a federal deputy. The silence outside stretched out. You have about 4 hours before that deputy arrives. You can try to take 2 witnesses out of a fortified position in the dark, knowing you've got 2 men down and federal help coming, or you can cut your losses and ride. That's the arithmetic. He heard Quillen moving. Not toward the house. Away from it. Then a horse. Then 2. Then nothing but the November wind moving through the cottonwoods. Mathis let out a long, slow breath. Across the room, Sahdii straightened up from the corner and lowered the revolver. The man at the kitchen table hadn't moved. The one face down on the floor was keeping absolutely still. You could have told me. You would have tried to handle it yourself, alone, at night, approaching their camp. And Quillen would have seen one man coming and adjusted. Matter of fact, no accusation in it. My way gave us 2 positions instead of 1. He thought about this honestly for a moment. You're not wrong. No, she agreed, without any particular satisfaction in it, just the acknowledgement of something that was simply true. Deputy Hurt arrived before dawn with 2 men behind him, which meant Calhoun had moved faster than Sahdii had expected. He was thin and efficient, proud of his mustache, and he took their statements at the kitchen table while Sahdii made coffee for everyone with the composure of a woman for whom this was just the morning's work. Hurt went north along the ridge trail with the first light and found the Quillens' camp at the Alkali Seep, precisely where Sahdii had described it. Fire still smoking, the blue roan horse tied to a juniper. Hector Quillen had made it about 6 miles before he lost his nerve or his direction in the dark and stopped to wait for daylight. It was a mistake. They brought him in before noon. Mathis stood on his porch and watched them ride past with Quillen in irons. The man looked at him from the saddle with those flat, reasonable eyes and said nothing at all. The paint horse came back 2 days later. Hurt's men had found the Quillen's string of stolen horses and sorted them out, and Sahdii's paint, a small, sturdy mare with markings Sahdii had described in exact detail, down to a white star on the near hind fetlock, had been among them. One of the deputy's riders brought her up the ranch road in the late afternoon, and Sahdii went out to meet her with her hands open and her face doing something quiet and private. Mathis gave her the space for that without being asked. The medicine bundle came back intact. The Quillens had kept it, apparently deciding that a leather bundle had to hold something valuable. They hadn't been wrong about that part, they'd just been wrong about what form the value took. Sahdii and inventoried it at the kitchen table that evening, laying each thing out and checking it and repacking it in precise order. Mathis sat across from her and watched. When she was done, she tied the flap closed and smoothed it once with her palm, a small gesture, like closing a door you'd been worried about, and then looked up at him. Your people will have their medicines for winter. Yes, he was quiet a moment. That's a long ride east. 2 days, you said. I know the route. When were you planning on going? She turned the bundle in her hands once. I had not decided. He understood both things she was telling him at the same time. She was a medicine woman, and she had responsibilities she took seriously. People were waiting for what she was carrying. She had been gone longer than planned already. Those things were real and had weight, and she was not the kind of person who looked away from real things. But she had also not decided to leave. And that was real too, and she was choosing to let him know it. Your shoulder. I think it needs another session. She looked at him levelly. Your shoulder's been fine for 4 days. Felt a little tight this morning. You are lying. I am, he agreed without embarrassment. For the first time in all the days she'd been there, Sahdii smiled fully. Brief, transforming, gone, but it had been there, and he'd seen it. I will go in 4 days. I will take the medicines to my people. Then I will come back. He nodded once, slow and careful, not wanting to push anything. The herb garden. If I'm not here to clear it properly before the frost, you'll lose what came back. I don't know what I'm doing with a garden. I know that. She picked up the medicine bundle and set it beside her bedroll. Ready. That's why I'm coming back. She paused, and he could see her maintaining her seriousness with a small, deliberate effort. Also, your shoulder will genuinely tighten again if no one attends to it. That is not a lie. The joint needs regular care. He almost laughed, a sound surprised out of him before he caught it. She rode out on the fourth morning. He stood at the corral fence and watched her go, the paint mare moving easy on the trail east. Sahdie's back straight and her hair braided and the medicine bundle tied behind the saddle. She didn't look back until she reached the bend where the trail turned through the cottonwoods. Then she did, and he raised his hand, and she did the same, and then the cottonwoods were between them, and she was gone. He stood there a moment. Then he got a shovel and went to the kitchen garden. The days that followed had a texture he hadn't expected. He had thought absence would feel like the old grief, the formless, pressing weight of a house emptied of Anna, but this was something different. This was the absence of a specific sound and a specific weight in the air, the sound of someone working alongside him in the pre-dawn quiet, the presence of someone whose attention was elsewhere in a room and made the room feel inhabited in a way a man alone couldn't create for himself no matter what he did. He rose at the usual hour each morning and went through the usual work, and the work got done the same as always. But the quality of the silence had changed. Before Sahdii, it had been the silence of a man who had stopped expecting it to lift. Now it was the silence of waiting, which is entirely different, because waiting has direction and the other kind does not. He found himself in the kitchen garden most mornings before the sun was fully up, doing what she had shown him, pulling dead matter carefully, checking the soil for moisture, protecting the root crowns of the things she'd identified. He didn't do it perfectly. He made mistakes, pulled a plant he shouldn't have, missed something he should have cleared, but he kept at it, because it was something she'd asked him to look after, and because the garden was changing under his hands in small ways that felt like progress, and because the episode she'd pointed out in the far corner was putting out new growth despite the cold, which seemed like a good sign about more than just the garden. At the north fence one afternoon, checking the wire repair he'd made the week before the Quillens arrived, he found himself turning over the conversation they'd had about the Alkali Seep, the way she'd filed that piece of information away, not as a worry to share with him, but as a resource to act on, quietly, in the margin of an ordinary day. He had spent 11 years reading this valley, and he hadn't thought of the Seep. She'd been here a week. He didn't find that embarrassing. He found it interesting. He thought about other things she'd shown him in those 7 days, not shown in the sense of demonstrated, but in the sense of made visible. The third afternoon, crouched beside the tool shed mending a hinge, she'd reached past him for a tool and her hand brushed the plant growing up the south wall, the scraggly vine he'd been meaning to pull for 2 years. She'd stopped, looked at it the way she looked at things that deserved attention. Yerba de la Negrita, she said. He'd never known the name. It grew all over this valley and he'd never known the name. She told him what it was for, women in difficult labor, she said, and fevers that wouldn't break, and the specific kind of joint pain that came with aging in cold country, and he understood in that moment that he had been walking past a pharmacy for 11 years and hadn't known it. He told her something in return, how to read a steer's gait from 200 yards for the early signs of hoof rot, the small asymmetry in the stride that most men didn't catch until the animal was already suffering. She paid close attention. The exchange felt like a handshake, a first one, the kind you give someone you expect to be doing business with for a long time. She came back in 7 days. He'd expected 4, or maybe 5. 7 meant something had been complicated at the camp, or she'd stayed longer than she'd intended, and he didn't ask which because she'd tell him when she was ready. She rode up the ranch road at midday with the paint moving easy and her face carrying the particular expression of a person who has completed a necessary thing and is already thinking about a different one. She unsaddled the mare and turned her into the corral with Copper. The two horses stood together without any drama, as if they'd been sharing the space all along. Sahdii came to where Mathis was standing at the fence and stood beside him, looking at the horses for a moment. "My aunt asked about you," Sahdii said, still watching the horses. "What did you tell her? That you were a rancher in the San Simon Valley who was not very good at gardens?" "Fair," he said, "and that you had stood against men who wished me harm." She was quiet a moment. She asked if I intended to come back. "What did you say?" She looked at him directly. In that straightforward way she had that left no room for misreading. "That I already had." He turned to face her. The October light was low and warm on her face, and the cottonwoods behind her had turned fully gold since she'd left. The brief, intense gold that only lasts a week before the leaves start letting go. He put his hand out, open, not reaching, just offering. She looked at his hand. Then she put hers in it, and they stood like that for a while, looking at the horses, not needing to say anything else to cover it. "The yarrow came up," he said eventually. "I saw it when I rode in. The episode, too. You've been watering every other day." "Like you said." She turned his hand over in both of hers, looked at the new calluses from the shovel work, and set it back down with her fingers still laced through his. "Your shoulder," she said, "actually is tight today," he told her. She made a sound that was almost a laugh, low and brief, surprised out of her, and he felt it go through him like something warm hitting the back of his chest, like the particular ease that comes when a thing you've been holding without knowing you were holding it finally releases. He had thought, in the years since Anna, that the house had become what it would be going forward, a place where one careful man lived and worked and didn't expect the shape of things to change. He had made a kind of peace with that. Not a happy peace, but a functional one. The kind that gets a person through their days without too much damage, that keeps the work done, and the cattle counted and the fences in order. Standing at his corral fence with Sahdii's hand in his, he understood that particular peace was finished. He wasn't sure what came next. But the uncertainty felt different from the old kind. It felt like the beginning of something instead of the middle of nothing. The weeks that followed moved differently than the months before them. As November turned toward December and the mornings arrived with frost on the ground, the ranch changed in small ways that added up to something considerable. Sahdii worked the physic garden every morning and nursed it toward dormancy with the kind of purposeful care that gives a plant a genuine chance at spring. She found Anna's small ledger in the kitchen cabinet, a record of what had been planted and where and when, kept in Anna's neat hand, and read through it carefully, consulting it the way you consult a map of country you're just learning. She brought up Anna directly and without awkwardness when she had questions about the garden or the house, the way you'd ask about the previous occupant of a place out of practical interest. Mathis responded in kind. The ease of it surprised him. Grief, it turned out, didn't need protection for being talked about. It just needed company that could hold it without making it into something either of them needed to manage. Sahdii's medicines went out into the valley in quiet ways. She helped a neighbor's wife with a persistent cough using osha root tea, and word traveled the way it does in a small valley, and people began coming by the ranch with ailments they hadn't known where to take. Not many people, enough. One afternoon in December, a rancher named Aldous Farr rode up from the south end of the valley with a swollen hand he'd wrapped in a dirty cloth and was trying not to look at. He sat down on the porch steps, and Sahdii unwrapped it without comment, held it up to the light, turned it once. How long, where it started, fever or not. He gave terse answers in the way of a man who was embarrassed to have an ailment and more embarrassed to need help with it. She diagnosed a deep bruise with early infection along the tendon, cleaned the wound with what she had, packed it with prickly percle poultice, and gave him instructions for the next 4 days in the flat, direct way that made clear this was information, not opinion, and that following it was up to him. Aldous Farr was not a man who took advice easily. Mathis had known him for 7 years and watched him argue with a blacksmith about the correct way to shoe his own horse. But he listened to every word Sahdii spoke and left with the cloth wrapped exactly as she'd shown him. Mathis watched all of this from across the yard, leaning against the corral post, and understood something about her that he hadn't fully articulated before. She was not a woman who had been made smaller by what had happened at the creek. She had been temporarily separated from the tools of her work, and now she had the tools back, and this was what she looked like at full power. It was something worth being present for. He received them on the porch with a matter-of-fact authority that made clear she was giving them a healer's attention, not a charity case's sympathy. The right questions, a methodical diagnosis from someone who has been doing this since she was young, and specific instructions on the way out. Never vague reassurances. On a December evening with the first real snow coming sideways through the cottonwoods and both of them inside by the fire, Mathis looked across the table at Sahdii sorting yarrow seeds she dried, saving them for spring planting, and felt the weight of what he wanted to say pressing for a particular moment, and decided this one was as good as any. "I'm not going to ask you to give up your people." She set down the seeds and looked at him. "I know that's not what this would be." He turned his cup on the table, looking for words that said what he meant precisely. "But I'd like to know. Can this be your place too? Not instead of where you come from, in addition to it?" Sahdii was quiet for a moment. He could see her taking the question seriously, the way she took all things. She was going to give it an honest answer rather than a fast one, because a fast answer would be disrespectful to what he was actually asking. "I was already thinking of it as my place." He looked at her. "Since the 3rd day, maybe the 2nd. A beat. I am a practical person." He let out a slow breath. "I've noticed that about you. The garden needed someone, and you needed someone to watch the north tree line at night." Delivered without humor, which made it funnier. "And your shoulder will keep tightening without regular attention. These are practical considerations. Is that the whole list?" She stood and came around the table to where he was sitting, and looked down at him with that direct steadiness she brought to everything, the seriousness that was not coldness, but its own kind of warmth. The warmth of a person who means what they say and has learned that meaning things is its own form of tenderness. "You gave me your coat. In the dark. A stranger you had no reason to help. You didn't ask why I needed it. You didn't make me feel what you were giving, or make me feel what I owed. You just threw it across the water." He stood, her hands came to rest against his chest. "That," and she paused a beat, "is also on the list." He brought his forehead down to rest against hers. Outside, the snow was settling in the garden beds Anna had planted and Sahdii had cleared, and the cottonwoods were still, and the fire behind them made the room the color of late afternoon, golden and warm in the way a room only gets when the cold outside is genuinely cold and the warmth inside is earned. "Then you stay. I stay." In the spring, the Fizz garden came back the way she'd said it would, better than before because it had been properly cared for through the winter. Anna's epizode came up strong in the front beds, and Sahdii's yarrows spread through the back, and along the south wall where the sun held longest, she planted the things her elder had taught her, osha seedlings and willow bark cuttings, and a row of dried prickly pear pads that took root slowly through April and were showing green by May. The garden had stopped being a thing he walked past without looking and become a thing that had someone tending it, which is what gardens need. The valley people knew her by spring. A rancher's wife to the east had named Sahdii specifically in a letter to her sister in Tucson as the reason her youngest child had come through a bad lung sickness in February, and the letter had been read aloud at church because good news travels in hard country even faster than bad news does. Sahdii's band sent for her in March, A messenger arriving at the ranch road on a gray morning with a letter in a hand Sahdii recognized. The elder was sick, not dying but needing her knowledge. A respiratory sickness that had been working through the camp and wasn't breaking right. She read the letter twice, folded it, set it on the table. Mathis was outside when she came to find him. He knew what the letter had said from the way she was standing. "How long do you need?" he said. She looked at the mountains to the east for a moment. 2 weeks, maybe 3. "Then go," he said. "I'll be here." She packed her medicines that afternoon with the same careful order she always used. The clay pots wrapped and nested, the dried herbs in their paper, the bone tools secured. She left the ledger on the table open, to the page where she'd marked what still needed doing in the garden. She left the prickly pear poultice she'd made the previous week, with a note beside it explaining its use in her clear, slightly formal hand. A note for him, in case someone came while she was gone. She was back in 18 days. The elder had recovered. The medicine had held. She came through the ranch gate in the late afternoon, with the sun behind her and the paint mare's hooves ringing on the ground. And Mathis was at the corral, and he didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at her the way you look at something you're glad to see. "The elder," he finally said, recovering well. "She sends you something." Sahdii reached into her saddlebag and held out a small bundle wrapped in cloth, dried herbs, carefully selected. The kind of gift that costs real work to give. "She says a man who tends a physic garden through winter deserves to know what grows in it." He took the bundle carefully and looked at it. "What is it? Open it slowly. Some of it will scatter." He opened it. Inside were seeds, a dozen different varieties, carefully labeled in small script he couldn't read. He looked at her. "She wrote what each one is," Sahdii said. "I'll translate." He stood there holding the bundle, and the feeling in his chest was something he would have had difficulty naming exactly. Gratitude was part of it, and the recognition of being welcomed into something, and a simple warmth that came from the understanding that the woman he loved carried him forward with her even when she was going back to her people. Mathis and Sahdii were married in May, outside, with the cottonwoods in new leaf and the paint mare and copper in the corral behind the ceremony, and a handful of valley neighbors who had become, if not quite friends, then the good kind of neighbors, the kind a person is glad to have when years get hard. Sahdii's aunt came 4 days on horseback and arrived the morning before, looked Mathis over with the same direct measuring eyes Sahdii used when she was making a decision about something, and said very little. That evening, while Sahdii was inside with her aunt, the old woman came out to the porch where Mathis was watching the last of the light and stood beside him without preamble. After a long silence, in careful English, "She is not easy. No, she will argue with you when you are wrong, and sometimes when you are right. I've noticed she chose this." The old woman turned to look at him directly. She had good reasons to go east with the band. Many good reasons. She chose to come back here instead. That is not a small thing, Mathis Reyes. "I know it," Mathis said. "I'm not going to make her regret it." She studied him for another moment. Then she nodded once and went back inside. The county ledger in Cochise County recorded the marriage that summer. 2 names, a date, a location. San Simon Valley, Arizona Territory. 3 lines on a page among hundreds of others. What those 3 lines couldn't hold was the size of what had started at a creek crossing in October, with a coat thrown across cold water in the dark, and the particular quality of attention one person pays to another when they are choosing, against the weight of grief and loss and all the ordinary reasons not to let something in. The physique garden grew. The house held 2 people where it had held 1 for too long, and in the mornings, when the light came over the Dos Cabezas and the frost was still on the ground and the valley was quiet, the way it only gets in that first hour before the day fully begins, you would sometimes see them both out there in the garden. One woman who knew the name of every plant and what it was for and what it needed. One man learning slowly, both of them working in the unhurried way of people who are going to have plenty of time to get it right.